When the HOA president ordered the lake drained to push through her luxury expansion plans, she thought she was controlling the land. But within days, nature flipped the script, and the damage that followed wiped out everything she'd built. The lake had always been the heart of our community. Long before the HOA president ever set foot near it with her clipboards and consultants, the lake was why people bought property here in the first place. It stretched wide and calm behind our homes, reflecting the sky in the early mornings and turning copper orange at sunset. Kids learned to fish off its wooden edges, their laughter echoing across the water. Couples kayaked across it on quiet weekends, their paddles breaking the glassy surface. Wildlife thrived along its banks, herons standing sentinel in the shallows, turtles sunning themselves on half-submerged logs, deer drinking at dusk, and the occasional otter if you were lucky enough to spot one. That all changed the day the water disappeared. I noticed it early one morning while walking the fence line on my ranch. The air felt wrong, dry, dusty, sharp in my lungs. When I reached the hill that overlooked the lake, my boots stopped cold. My breath caught. Where there should have been shimmering water was a vast, cracked basin of exposed mud. The shoreline had retreated so far it looked like the lake had simply evaporated overnight, as if some giant hand had reached down and stolen it away. Pipes jutted from the earth like broken bones. Heavy equipment tracks cut deep scars through the mud. The smell of rot and sulfur hung thick in the air, making my stomach turn. Someone had drained it. Within hours, the neighborhood group chat exploded with panic and rage. Photos poured in from every angle, dead fish flopping desperately in shallow puddles, boats stranded on their sides like beached whales, docks collapsed into the sludge. Parents were furious, their children's summer playground destroyed. Long-time residents were bewildered, hearts breaking over a place they'd loved for decades. And everyone kept asking the same question, over and over, like a prayer that might somehow change reality. Who authorized this? The answer arrived by lunchtime. An email from the HOA president landed in our inboxes, written in her usual polished tone. Cool, confident, dismissive of any concern that wasn't her own. She explained that the lake had been temporarily drained, as part of a strategic redevelopment initiative aimed at maximizing community value. According to her, the exposed lakebed would allow contractors to assess expansion opportunities for a luxury resort wing, cabins, dining facilities, and exclusive access amenities. She signed it with a flourish, as if she expected applause. What she didn't mention was that the lake wasn't just decorative. It was structural. The lake fed underground water tables, stabilized the soil around half the properties, and regulated drainage during heavy rain. It supported wetlands downstream. It was protected under environmental guidelines the HOA had no authority to override without permit. She knew that. Everyone knew that. But she'd been pushing boundaries since the day she became HOA president, fines for grass length, approved paint shades, access restrictions to shared land. Draining the lake was just the biggest flex yet. A power move meant to show she was untouchable, that rules were suggestions she could ignore. That afternoon, I drove down to the lake access road, anger simmering in my chest. A temporary chain-link fence had already gone up, wrapped with bright warning tape. A security guard stood at the gate, arms crossed, blocking residents from entering their own community space. I asked him who gave the order. He didn't hesitate. HOA president. By evening, the consequences started showing themselves. Fish carcasses floated in the remaining puddles, drawing flies and scavengers in a grotesque feast. The exposed mud cracked deeper as the sun baked it dry, opening wounds in the earth. Without the lake's pressure, nearby retaining walls began to creak ominously. One neighbor reported their dock shifting overnight, tilting at an impossible angle. Another found a sinkhole forming near their driveway, the ground simply giving way beneath decades of stability. Still, the HOA president doubled down. At an emergency meeting she called, without allowing public comments, she blamed unexpected natural conditions and accused residents of spreading misinformation. She promised everything was under control, her voice sharp with irritation at being questioned. But nature doesn't care about confidence. 2 days later, dark clouds rolled in like an army. The rain didn't start gently. It slammed down in sheets, hammering the exposed lakebed like a drum. Without water to absorb the impact, the dry soil turned instantly into sludge. Channels carved themselves through the mud with frightening speed, directing runoff toward the very structures she'd planned to profit from. I stood on my porch, watching the storm rage with a mixture of dread and grim understanding, and realized something important. The lake had been holding everything together. And now that it was gone, nothing was stopping what came next. That night, sirens echoed through the valley, their wails cutting through the rain like screams. By morning, the empire she'd tried to build was already beginning to crack. By sunrise, the damage was impossible to ignore. The storm had passed, but it left behind a transformed landscape, one that looked less like a planned resort site and more like a disaster zone, a battlefield where nature had won decisively. Where manicured paths once traced the lakeshore, deep gouges cut through the earth like open wounds. Mudslides had swallowed sections of decorative fencing whole. The retaining wall near the proposed resort foundation leaned at a dangerous angle, its concrete base exposed like a cracked tooth, threatening to give way entirely. Residents gathered along the road in silence, staring in shock and disbelief. No one needed to say it out loud. This wasn't an accident. This was a consequence. Emergency vehicles arrived mid-morning. Not for us, for the resort construction site. Contractors argued with inspectors, voices rising in frustration and fear. Engineers took measurements, their faces tight and serious, professional masks barely concealing their alarm. One of them crouched near a fresh collapse and shook his head slowly, as if confirming something he'd warned about long ago, something no one had wanted to hear. The lake hadn't just been drained. It had been removed from a system that depended on it. By noon, the HOA president finally showed up. She stepped out of her SUV wearing pristine boots that sank immediately into the mud with a wet squelch. Her expression hardened as cameras from residents' phones turned toward her like accusatory eyes. For the first time since this began, she looked uncertain, not panicked but rattled, as if the ground beneath her authority had shifted just as surely as the soil beneath her feet. She waved off questions with sharp, defensive gestures and marched straight toward the inspectors, insisting the damage was minor and temporary. I stood close enough to hear the response. "This site is unstable," one of them said flatly, his tone leaving no room for argument. "You removed a critical water body without environmental clearance. That triggered soil failure." She scoffed, trying to summon her old confidence. "It was just a lake." The inspector didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. No. It was load-bearing. That word followed her all day. Load-bearing. By afternoon, official notices went up. Construction was halted immediately. Access to the resort area was restricted. Environmental agencies were notified due to wildlife loss and downstream impact. The HOA president's carefully controlled project was no longer in her hands. It belonged to regulators now, strangers who couldn't be intimidated or fined into submission. That's when she pivoted. That evening, another email went out to the community. This one sounded very different. Gone was the confidence. In its place was outrage, aimed squarely at uncooperative residents and outside interference. She accused locals of exaggerating the damage, of sabotaging progress, of threatening the community's future with their complaints and concerns. Then she named names. Mine included. According to her, my ranch, situated downhill from the drained lake, was non-compliant with updated drainage expectations. She claimed runoff from my land worsened the collapse. She hinted at legal action. Fines. Forced modifications. It was a desperate move and everyone could see it. The mask had slipped completely. The truth was simpler. She needed someone else to blame. What she didn't realize was that the paper trail was already catching up to her, an avalanche of evidence she couldn't outrun. Over the next 24 hours, records surfaced. Old environmental surveys clearly stating the lake could not be drained without multi-agency approval. Emails between HOA board members expressing concerns she dismissed with barely concealed contempt. A contractor's warning about soil liquefaction if the water table was disrupted, marked urgent and ignored. She had ignored them all. By the following morning, the county stepped in. A stop-work order became a closure notice. The lakeside resort, still half-built, still promising luxury that would never arrive, was officially shut down pending investigation. Bookings were canceled. Investors pulled out, their money vanishing as quickly as the lake water. Employees were sent home indefinitely, their livelihoods suspended because of one person's arrogance. And then nature delivered the final blow. Without the lake to regulate runoff, the next rainstorm, smaller than the first, sent water rushing through newly carved channels with terrifying efficiency. Flooding reached the resort's lower structures, destroying electrical systems and warping unfinished floors. Mold bloomed within days, black and toxic. What wasn't damaged by water was ruined by time. Standing at the edge of my property, watching the aftermath unfold like a slow-motion collapse, I felt no triumph. Just a heavy sense of inevitability, of watching something that could have been prevented play out to its bitter end. The lake had protected this place for decades. She'd drained it for profit. And in doing so, she'd exposed everything she built to the one force she couldn't fine, intimidate, or vote down. Nature hadn't taken sides. It had simply reclaimed what was never hers to remove. The silence didn't last. 2 days after the closure notice went public, the HOA president called an emergency board meeting. Not the open, heavily advertised kind she used when everything went her way. This one was quiet, rushed, and invitation only. But word travels fast in small communities, especially when people are angry and scared and finally ready to speak. By the time the meeting started, half the neighborhood was already gathered outside the clubhouse, a silent wall of witnesses. I didn't go inside. I didn't need to. Through the glass doors, I could see raised voices, sharp hand gestures, and faces drained of their usual confidence. The empire she'd built on authority and intimidation was cracking, fracturing along fault lines she'd created herself, and everyone felt it. Inside, she tried to regain control. She blamed contractors. She blamed regulators. She blamed misinformation campaigns and reactionary residents resistant to growth. Her voice rose with each accusation, growing more desperate, more shrill. What she didn't do, not once, was take responsibility for draining the lake. That omission mattered, because while she was trying to save face, the investigation was accelerating. County officials returned with state environmental agents in tow. Soil experts drilled deep test cores across the former lakebed and surrounding slopes, their equipment humming with methodical precision. Wildlife officers documented dead fish, displaced birds, and contaminated runoff downstream, their reports growing thicker by the day. Each report added weight to the same conclusion: the damage wasn't incidental. It was structural, ecological, and entirely preventable. The lake wasn't just scenery. It was infrastructure. As the findings stacked up, so did the consequences. Fines were issued first, numbers so large they made board members physically recoil when they saw them, faces going pale with shock. Then came compliance orders. Restore the lake, stabilize the land, remediate environmental damage. Each order came with deadlines and penalties for non-compliance that would bankrupt them all. That's when panic set in. The HOA didn't have the money. The resort project had already drained reserves, and now investors were gone. Insurance refused coverage, citing unauthorized environmental modification. Banks froze credit lines pending the outcome of the investigation. Overnight, the HOA went from powerful to insolvent, from untouchable to desperate. And when money disappears, loyalty follows. Board members began resigning, quietly at first, then all at once, like rats fleeing a sinking ship. Emails leaked. Recorded meetings surfaced. In every one of them, the same pattern appeared. Warnings ignored, risks dismissed, objections overridden by one voice. Hers. She tried to fight back. She hired lawyers. She filed countersuits. She accused the county of overreach and residents of conspiracy, her accusations growing wilder and more scattered. She even attempted to revive her attack on me, filing a formal complaint claiming my ranch had benefited from the lake's drainage. That argument collapsed in minutes. Property records showed my land predated the HOA entirely. Environmental maps confirmed my runoff patterns hadn't changed in decades. And then came the detail she hadn't anticipated. The lake had actually protected her development from my side of the watershed, not the other way around. Her own actions had exposed the resort to natural forces it was never designed to withstand. By the end of the week, enforcement vehicles lined the resort entrance. Barriers went up. Warning signs replaced marketing banners. The once glossy project that promised luxury and growth now looked abandoned. Half-built structures streaked with water damage, warped wood, and creeping mold that fed on her ambitions. Residents stopped whispering. At the grocery store, at the post office, at the gas station, people talked openly now, about how afraid they'd been to speak up before, how fines and threats had kept them quiet, how relieved they felt watching accountability finally arrive. The silence she'd enforced had broken, and in its place was something stronger, collective courage. The HOA president didn't appear in public anymore. When she did, it was brief. Slipping into offices, avoiding eye contact, her posture stiff and guarded like a hunted animal. The woman who once ruled every meeting with a smile and a threat now moved like someone waiting for the ground to give way beneath her. And in a sense, it already had. Late Friday afternoon, the final notice was posted. The HOA was placed under temporary administrative control pending restructuring. All major decisions were suspended. Assets, including the resort, were frozen. An independent auditor was assigned to assess damages and liability. Her empire was officially out of her hands. Standing by the old fence line where the lake once met my land, I watched the wind ripple across exposed mud flats, stirring dust that should have been spray. Birds circled overhead, confused and calling out, searching for water that should have been there. Restoration crews would come eventually. The lake would return, slowly, imperfectly. But what was gone for good was the illusion that power could override nature. She'd believed authority was absolute. She'd believed rules bent for those who enforced them. She'd believed the land was just another thing to control, another asset to be managed and monetized. And for a while, everyone let her believe it. Until the lake disappeared. Until the ground shifted. Until nature, patient, impartial, and unstoppable, showed exactly how fragile her empire had always been. By the time the investigation became public, the HOA president's authority had already started to unravel. The county's notice wasn't subtle. It cited environmental negligence, unauthorized alteration of protected water systems, and failure to disclose material risks to investors and residents. Copies went not only to the HOA board, but to state environmental agencies, zoning enforcement, and, most importantly, the insurance carriers underwriting the resort project. That's when the panic set in. The board called an emergency meeting behind closed doors. For years, those meetings had been ceremonial, rubber stamps for whatever the president wanted. This one lasted 6 hours. Voices were raised loud enough to be heard through walls. Doors were slammed. One board member reportedly walked out entirely, unable to stomach what was unfolding. By morning, rumors spread faster than official updates, whispered conversations turning into open accusations. The HOA's insurer had issued a reservation of rights letter. Translation: they might not cover a single dollar of the damage. Investors were demanding answers, their lawyers already drafting complaints. Contractors were filing notices of non-payment. Employees were threatening wrongful termination claims after being sent home without severance or explanation. And right at the center of it all was one decision: draining the lake. The president tried one last tactic: intimidation. I received a formal letter accusing me of interfering with HOA operations and publicly misrepresenting facts. It demanded I stop speaking to regulators and warned of legal consequences if I didn't comply. The threat was clear: shut up or suffer. I forwarded it to the county investigator. He replied with one sentence: "Thank you. This helps." 2 days later, the board flipped. An internal memo leaked to residents announcing the president had been temporarily relieved of operational authority pending review. The wording was careful, legal speak designed to avoid liability, but the meaning was clear. She was out. Not officially yet, but effectively stripped of the power she'd wielded like a weapon. She didn't take it quietly. She showed up at the site again, this time alone, shouting at inspectors who refused to engage, her voice cracking with desperation. When that failed, she confronted residents in parking lots and driveways, accusing them of betrayal, of destroying everything she'd worked to build. Phones came out. Videos went up. The image she'd carefully cultivated, decisive leader, protector of property values, collapsed into something uglier: raw, unfiltered desperation. Then came the financial disclosure. As part of the investigation, the HOA was forced to open its books. What emerged was worse than anyone expected. Reserve funds had been diverted to the resort project without proper votes or documentation. Environmental compliance budgets had been zeroed out entirely. Contingency funds, required by law, were missing, simply gone. Every shortcut traced back to her. Every signature was hers. Every decision had her fingerprints all over it. The state stepped in next. They issued a formal cease and desist, not just halting the resort, but freezing HOA accounts tied to the project. Assets were locked. Payments stopped. The empire she'd built, contracts, influence, leverage, ceased to function overnight, collapsing like a house of cards in a strong wind. Nature wasn't finished either. With the lake gone, erosion continued relentlessly. A nearby access road cracked and partially collapsed after another rain. The county closed it indefinitely. What was meant to be a luxury destination was now inaccessible, unstable, and legally radioactive, a monument to hubris that no one could visit. Residents who once supported her began asking a different question: how much is this going to cost us? The answer was brutal. Special assessments were proposed to cover legal fees and remediation, thousands per household, money most people didn't have. Property values dipped almost immediately. Sellers pulled listings in panic. Buyers walked away. The very future she'd claimed to secure was now uncertain because of her ambition, because she'd gambled with everyone's homes and lost. And then, finally, the board made it official. She was removed. Not resigned. Removed. The announcement was brief and carefully worded, vetted by lawyers who knew what was coming next, but it included one telling line: the former president acted outside the scope of her authority. That single sentence shifted everything. Liability moved from the HOA to her personally. Lawsuits followed within days. Investors seeking damages, contractors demanding payment, even the HOA itself turning against her to limit its own exposure. Her assets were targeted. Her legal team changed twice in 1 week, each set of lawyers apparently realizing what they were up against. The confidence she once wielded evaporated under the weight of consequences she could no longer redirect. I watched it all from a distance. No victory speech. No confrontation. No satisfaction. Just the quiet understanding that systems, natural or legal, will always correct imbalance eventually. It might take time, but gravity works on empires just as surely as it works on water. She thought she controlled the land. She thought authority could override reality. But water remembers where it belongs. Soil remembers what holds it together. And power, when abused, always leaves a record, one that can't be erased, no matter how many emails you send or threats you make. Her empire wasn't destroyed by enemies. It collapsed under the weight of its own disregard, for nature, for law, and for the limits no title can erase. By the time the first real storm rolled in, the lake was already gone. What had once been a wide, glistening body of water was now a cracked basin of exposed mud, half-buried debris, and dying reeds, a graveyard of what used to be. The HOA president, Elaine Porter, stood on the balcony of her lakeside mansion, arms crossed, jaw set with stubborn certainty, convinced she had won. The construction crews were scheduled. The permits, she insisted, were handled. The future resort expansion would sit exactly where the water used to be. Then the rain came. It started gently, almost politely. A steady drizzle that darkened the dry earth and softened the dust. Elaine dismissed it entirely, barely glancing at the sky. She had engineers, consultants, drainage plans laid out in glossy presentations. What she didn't have was the lake itself, the natural system that had managed runoff, pressure, and saturation for decades, long before she arrived with her ambitions. Within 12 hours, the drizzle became a downpour. Without the lake to absorb excess water, runoff rushed downhill unchecked, a torrent with nowhere to go. The exposed basin turned into a funnel, pulling rainwater and debris straight toward the lowest points: roads, foundations, retaining walls. By morning, the first sinkhole opened near the resort's private access road, swallowing asphalt like it was tissue paper. By noon, there were 3 more. Residents woke to flooded basements, collapsing garden walls, and cracks spiderwebbing across driveways like nature's handwriting spelling out a warning. The road leading to Elaine's resort buckled, one side sinking nearly a foot as water undermined the soil beneath it. Emergency crews arrived, surveyed the damage, then left, shaking their heads and taping off entire sections of the property. There was nothing they could do. This wasn't a problem you could fix with sandbags. Elaine tried to spin it. She sent out a mass email blaming unprecedented weather conditions. She accused nearby property owners of illegal water diversion. She even suggested sabotage, her paranoia showing through the cracks in her composure. But the county inspectors weren't buying it. They'd already reviewed satellite imagery, historical drainage data, and the lake's removal timeline. The conclusion was simple and devastating. Draining the lake had destabilized the entire watershed. Within 48 hours, the county issued a cease-and-desist order on all construction. Environmental agencies stepped in next, citing violations related to protected wetlands and wildlife displacement. Fines followed, massive ones. Each day the damage worsened, the numbers climbed higher, accumulating like interest on a debt she could never repay. Then the lawsuits began. Homeowners sued the HOA for property damage, their anger finally finding a legal outlet. The resort investors sued Elaine personally for misrepresentation and negligence, their trust evaporated along with their money. Even the construction company walked away, citing undisclosed environmental risks and refusing to be dragged down with her. Insurance refused to cover most of it. Intentional alterations to natural systems voided key clauses. Elaine's empire collapsed faster than the shoreline she'd erased. Her mansion, perched closest to the former lake, suffered the worst of it. The ground beneath one corner shifted dramatically, cracking the foundation with sounds like gunshots and rendering the structure unsafe. Red tags went up. She was forced to move out within days, escorted by inspectors while reporters gathered at the gate, cameras clicking, questions shouting. The same reporters she once ignored now plastered her face across headlines. HOA President's Lake Drains Sparks Environmental Disaster. Luxury Resort Dream Sinks After HOA Decision. Nature Strikes Back. At the emergency HOA meeting that followed, Elaine didn't even show up. Her lawyer sent a brief statement announcing her resignation, effective immediately. The words cold and clinical, devoid of apology or acknowledgement. The board voted unanimously to remove her anyway, just to be safe. The new president's first act was to cooperate fully with authorities. The second was to begin the process of restoring the lake. It took months, millions of dollars. Heavy machinery worked day and night to rebuild the basin, reinforce soil, and reintroduce water flow. Residents watched the progress with a mixture of hope and grief, knowing what was being rebuilt could never truly replace what had been lost. Even then, the lake never fully returned to what it had been. Some damage couldn't be undone. Some ecosystems, once destroyed, take generations to recover. But the lesson was permanent. You don't conquer nature. You don't override systems older than your title, your plans, or your ego. And you definitely don't drain a lake just because you think you own everything around it. As for Elaine, the last anyone heard, she'd sold what was left of her assets to settle claims and quietly left the state. No farewell email. No final statement. No acknowledgement of the destruction she'd caused. Just gone like water through broken pipe. The lake eventually refilled, its surface slowly returning to mirror the sky once more. Her empire never did.